Hey, greetings, friends, and welcome to week 5. This is going to be lecture 1. I think we'll probably be somewhere between 3 and 4 lectures this week. We'll kind of see how it goes as I kind of work the information throughout this week. But I want to pick up where we left off last week. Last week we began entry into this conversation about missional leadership. And I think for me this is central to the endeavors that many of us are giving ourselves to. How ought we to lead the people of God by the Spirit of God according to the Word of God to fulfill the mission of God? That we are given a unique opportunity as leaders within the church to move forward a group of people into God's redemptive purposes and designs. How ought we do so? And so we began that conversation last week by talking about the kinds of questions we need to ask, and then reckoning with the kind of leader that requires us to be, and then talking a little bit about the APES, the apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, and teachers, which I'll take up again a little bit later on in these set of lectures. But I thought what I would do here in lecture 1 is to give you a little bit of additional background into my journey in the variety of leadership contexts that I've been a part of, and what missional leadership has looked like within those variety of contexts, because that is one of the things that I want us to be very clear about as we begin to move forward in this set of lectures, is that missional leadership takes seriously the context that we find ourselves a part of. What I always say, and I got this from a friend of mine in Peoria at one point, is that dirt matters. Where we place our feet, the dirt of the places that we live and operate, the churches that we're in, the communities that we're a part of, all of that matters deeply. See, the old model of ministry and mission and leadership operated off of this sort of, I'm going to use these words, cultural hegemony, meaning that all cultures should be like the Western culture. We operated off our homogeneity, which means that all people are really the same and all the contexts that we minister are really the same. So all we really have to do is identify the strategic tactics that other places are utilizing and implement those into our settings. And I'm just not convinced that that's altogether adequate or accurate. In fact, I think that missional leadership takes serious the call to step incarnationally and inculturatedly into the communities that we find ourselves in. I've had the privilege of really living in 4 very different communities that I did ministry in. The first of which was a town of about 135,000. It was Clarksville, Tennessee. It was in the South, but yet it was the most northern kind of southern city you could experience. It had a university, and then it also had a military base there. And so it felt like the South. There were so many other elements of it that didn't feel like the South, that it was this conglomeration, this unique mishmash of humanity all in one setting, in one place. And in that setting and in that place, we experienced a wide variety of missional engagement and opportunities. There were the kind of communities that we've talked about already in previous lectures, the kind of communities that drive us deep into the heart of the unique spaces and places we found ourselves in amongst the poor and the underserved and those communities that had been sort of left out and dismissed. But then I made a shift and I moved to a community of about 2,000 people in a county of 8,000 in rural Tennessee. There in that small town, I began to realize that much of what we had done in the larger community of Clarksville, how we'd operated missionally in that context, would be different than this context that I found myself now in. I then made a shift to a town of about 35,000 on the banks of the Peoria River, a once blue-collar community, a sort of a bedroom community of Peoria, that had become a place where many of the working poor in the area had found themselves. And now I live in a city of 2.8 million people in the city of Chicago. So as you can imagine, the variety of context has forced me to think about missional leadership differently in each context. In the context of Clarksville, we transformed a congregation that had been enmeshed in traditionalism into this thriving missional outpost. So we talked last week about the kinds of costs that are associated when you begin to do that because of the people that you begin to reach. But we began to learn a lot from that endeavor about what it means to take the risks of leaning out into the community, of finding ourselves in places we wouldn't otherwise find ourselves, amongst people that we wouldn't have otherwise met, bringing transformation in areas of the community that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to do so. And one of the areas that we had to reckon with was, how do we bring people along? There was there was early adopters, of course, as a part of this. But we didn't want this to be solely the work of early adopters. We wanted to take seriously the call of bringing the congregation along in this process. And that's one of the unique challenges of missional leadership. We're not just superheroes running out front, doing all sorts of good things with God. We're called to bring people with us and bring people along. So we had to begin to ask the questions of what would it look like at the board level? What would that look like at a discipleship level? So we began to develop a discipleship system in which people would take a journey with us from the foundations of faith all the way through the work of doing compassion ministry and the work of justice and evangelism, because we wanted this to be ingrained in how they understood the Christian gospel to operate. We never wanted them to buy in early to this idea of spectator Christianity. We wanted to help them realize that the work that they did, that the lives that they lived, that the places they went to, those were the missional arenas of their lives. And so we wanted to help by embedding that in the very life of our DNA of a discipleship very early on. So I want to encourage you, as you think about missional leadership, in what ways does my discipleship match the desired outcomes of being a missional community of faith? And so you have to ask the discipleship question. We also had to realize that we had to begin to expose people to the different kinds of experiences that people might occur when they move out into the communities that we're sending them. So my friends Brett and Tara Smith developed what they call exposure therapy. And I thought this is a profound way. Many times, it's not that people are against the mission of God, it's that they have to realize that they don't often feel equipped, competent, or confident about going into these spaces and places that they've never been amongst people that they've never been with. And so Tara and Brett would help lead these groups of people into those settings. And then they would bring them back from those settings, and they would invite them to share their experiences. What difficulties did they experience? What challenges occurred? And then help them to process through those very things. So missional leadership in a town of 135,000 in a 100-year-old church that was born of traditionalism required a certain set of shifts and moves to take place at a foundational level. Now, again, like we talked about last week, that's met by cost and challenge, and we have to be aware that there's going to be resistance to that movement because it's unsettling to a group of faith. But perseverance and leading through, I think, is key in establishing this regular rhythm of missional engagement in a community. When I moved to this church in Erin, Tennessee, it was an amazing church. It had also a 100-year-old church that had an incredible history of reaching the community. The pastor that had been there 35 years. I was the third pastor in 50 years. 35 years he had been there. And one of the powerful things is that he had served at one point in the school system, superintendent. His wife was librarian. They had invested themselves in the life of the community. He was still, when I went there, on the school board. There was this key investment that they made in the community. Now, as I came as someone who was eager to lean out on the edge and see radical change take place in people's lives in this rural community, I knew that there had to be a pace to it. You can't move into a rural community, a small town, and just think that I'm just going to blow and go and make everything happen. I had to earn the respect by developing relationships and establishing trust. And I think that is sometimes something that leaders forget to do. It's not that these small communities are resistant to the kind of work that God wants to call them to. It's just that we can't go in with a cavalier attitude. We've got to recognize that there's people who have lived their lives in those communities. They know their communities, and they have much to offer the mission of God if we'll take time to listen. So the first thing that I did for the first 6 months that I was there, and I got this from a friend of mine by the name of Pastor Darren Brown, is I went on a listening tour. I spent 6 months of every Thursday with my friend Ed. We'd go house to house to people's houses. We'd sit and we'd eat pie and drink coffee, and we'd hear their stories, and we'd listen to their hearts, and we'd establish relationships, because I knew that if we were going to move forward, it was going to require a heavy relational, trust-filled relationship of moving forward. And then I had to communicate well that on the front end of my preaching. I had to care for people deeply. I had to commit to the culture of the community. I was an outsider. I was a foreigner. I was different. So part of my missional leadership is I learned how to hunt, because if I'm going to reach the guys as a part of this community, then I had to be where they were. I couldn't just come there with the presuppositions of the things that I liked and cared to do. I had to inculturate. I had to become a part of the community. Another thing I did is I volunteered coaching high school and middle school football, because there it put me in places and spaces with people to lead in ways that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to do so, because I forged relationships with people in the community in ways that would not have been available to me had I just been okay with sitting in my office and doing my thing. We had to take our time, and I want to tell you one quick story about this. About 3.5 years into it, I had a desire to bring Redemption Center to our community, which was going to have counseling and celebrate recovery, and we had a counselor that was already prepared. We had ministries that were already ready to go. And I knew it was going to take a huge leap for our congregation to get there, to be able to take that step. And so after about 3.5 years in, I began to work this idea with our folks. I began to have conversations with our leadership team. And after about a year of doing this, we just about to take a vote on whether or not we should do this. And all of these questions from my leadership began to spring up. And this was one of the most powerful stories in my life of ministry, is that at first I was frustrated. I was like, where were these questions when I wanted them, right? And then one of the things that I began to realize was these folks, they didn't want to let me down because they cared about me and they knew I cared about them. So I said, we're not going to vote today, okay? We're not going to, and I had one person say, I think we should push through because I'm not going to vote against Pastor Jeff. If Pastor Jeff wants to do this, we should go with it. And I said, that's not how this works. We're going to lead together. We're going to live together. We're going to do this together, and we're not going to do it at all. So I said, we're not going to vote. We're going to take the next 40 days prayer and fasting. And at one point, we're going to bring this before the congregation because we knew that they knew that we were having this conversation, and we're going to display a sign of unity. And at the end of 40 days, we're going to have a vote, and whatever that vote goes, we're going to trust it's the will of God. At the end of 40 days, beautiful time of prayer and unity and questions and fasting as a congregation, we came back and they voted against my idea. And the reason why they voted against my idea is because they felt like in order to do what I wanted them to do, we had to give up a huge part of what we were doing for the children and the youth in the community. We had a huge outreach for the children and youth. Like over 100 kids were coming into our facility every single week. And they didn't want to divide their time and divide the energy. And so one of the things that the person said right before we voted, he said that and this was on the board, he said that if we vote against Pastor Jeff, then we are all right now volunteering to help in our children's ministry. Because if we believe that the children's ministry matters that much, then we've got to back that up with our action. And we voted, and they voted me down, and you know what? I felt good about that. Because ultimately, it pushed them further into the mission of God, and I believe that it was the Spirit of God moving amongst the people of God, and I had to surrender that to the work of God that was happening in that congregation. So being a missional leader doesn't mean that I'm always right or that I can always see further down the road than anybody else or that I know God's heartbeat more than anybody else. It means living in this collective sets of relationships based on trust, based on this respect and affirmation that we have for one another and the work that God is doing in our midst. So I moved from Clarksville to Aaron, Tennessee. In the next lecture, I'll tell you about the last 2 shifts that I made and why this matters for us moving forward.